Mason Hale had been a cargo pilot for 12 long years, and he often joked that the stars were his neighbors. He had flown from the shining cities of Earth's colonies to the lonely outposts on the edge of known space. Life in the trade lanes was not exciting most days. It was mostly paperwork, hauling crates and checking fuel gauges. But Mason liked the quiet. He liked being his own boss. This time, his route had taken him to a small mining colony called Karas 7. It was not a beautiful place. The ground was reddish-brown, the sky always dusty, and the air tasted like iron. Most people here worked long shifts digging rare minerals out of the ground. Mason came here twice a year to deliver tools, spare parts, and packaged food. He would unload his cargo, sign a few papers, and leave. Normally that was all. But today, after finishing the delivery, Mason decided to stretch his legs and walk through the colony's small marketplace. The market was just a line of stalls made from metal sheets and faded cloth. Vendors sold everything from mining equipment to cheap trinkets for kids. The air buzzed with the sound of bargaining, the smell of grilled street food, and the clang of metal tools. Mason strolled past the stalls slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, his mind half on the trip home. He had no reason to buy anything, but then, near the end of the row, something caught his eye. It was a cage. Inside it sat a small creature covered in soft silver fur. Its body was about the size of a house cat, but its head was a little larger, with a short snout and two enormous, shining eyes. Those eyes were a deep, glowing blue, like polished gemstones. The creature's ears were long and pointed, twitching slightly at every sound. It didn't bark or meow. It simply sat still, gazing at Mason. He stopped in front of the stall without even thinking. The merchant behind the cage was a tall, thin alien with skin the color of green clay and a voice like grinding stones. "Rare pet," the merchant said quickly, as if trying to close the deal before Mason could ask questions. "Came from far beyond the Orion Drift. Very smart, loyal, easy to keep." Mason crouched down to look closer. The silver-furred creature tilted its head and blinked slowly at him. "What's it called?" Mason asked. The merchant shrugged. "No name. You give name. Very good companion. I sell cheap for you, only because I need to close my stall today." Mason frowned. He had no plans to keep a pet. Pets on a cargo ship were extra work, feeding, cleaning, making sure they didn't chew on cables. But something in the creature's calm gaze held him there. It didn't look frightened like most animals in cages. It looked curious, as if it was studying him as much as he was studying it. He stuck a finger through the bars carefully. The creature didn't bite. Instead, it leaned forward, pressed its small head against his hand, and made a soft sound, almost like a hum. The merchant saw his hesitation and leaned in. "For you, half price. You will not find again. This is special." Mason let out a quiet sigh. "Fine. How much is half price?" A few minutes later, credits had changed hands, and Mason was walking back toward his ship with the cage in his grip. The creature sat inside, silent but watching everything. When they reached his ship, the Stellar Wind, Mason placed the cage on a counter in the main hold. He opened the small door carefully. "All right, little one. You're free to roam. Just don't chew anything important." The creature stepped out slowly. On its 4 small legs, it padded across the floor, sniffing the air. The silver fur shimmered faintly under the lights. Mason set a shallow bowl of water nearby, and it went to drink without hesitation. "Guess I'll call you Whisk," Mason said aloud. "You've got whiskers, and I'm not feeling creative." Whisk raised its head at the sound of the name and looked straight at him. For a moment, Mason had the oddest feeling that the creature understood. The next 2 days in space were quiet. Mason charted a course back toward the main trade route. Whisk wandered the ship freely, sometimes curling up in the co-pilot's seat, sometimes disappearing into small corners. Mason fed it simple protein paste mixed with water, and it ate without complaint. But Mason began to notice small things. Once, while he was in the galley making coffee, he heard the sound of the cockpit door sliding open. He was sure he had locked it, but when he checked, the lock code was still active. Another time, the ship's navigation computer suddenly displayed a perfect shortcut through a dense asteroid field, something Mason hadn't programmed. He assumed it was a leftover setting from a previous job, and then there were the looks. Every so often, Mason would turn to find Whisk sitting nearby, those deep blue eyes fixed on him. Not in the way an animal stares at a food bowl, but in the way a person watches another person, quietly thinking. On the third night, Mason sat in the cockpit, feet up on the console, reading a digital novel. Whisk hopped into the co-pilot's seat, curling up neatly. Mason chuckled. "You really like that spot, huh?" Whisk blinked at him, then gave a quiet hum. "You're a strange one," Mason said, turning back to his novel. "But I guess you make the trip less boring." A week into the journey, the stellar wind was approaching a stretch of space near the Varn belt. Mason knew this area was prone to small ion storms, but they usually passed without trouble. Still, he kept an eye on the sensors. Sure enough, warning lights began to flash. The storm rolled in faster than expected. Static crackled over the comm systems, and the ship shuddered under the sudden energy surge. Mason tightened his harness and tried to steer out of the worst of it. "Hold on, Whisk," he muttered. But the next moment, a blinding flash filled the cockpit. The power flickered, alarms screamed, and Mason felt a sharp pain in his head before darkness swallowed him. When he woke, the storm had passed. The lights were dim but steady, and the hum of the engines sounded normal. Mason's vision cleared, slowly. He realized he was lying back in his chair, his harness unbuckled. Someone had unbuckled it. He turned his head and froze. Standing a few steps away was not Whisk. At least, not the Whisk he knew. Before him stood a tall, graceful figure, clearly not human. Her skin was a soft, shimmering teal, almost like polished stone underwater. Her hair fell in long, silvery strands that caught the light and seemed to move like liquid. Her eyes were the same deep, glowing blue as Whisk's, and she was wearing some sort of smooth, seamless garment that looked grown, not sewn. Mason's mouth went dry. The figure spoke, not with her mouth, but directly into his mind. "You are safe. The storm is gone." Mason's hands gripped the armrests. "Who? What?" The figure tilted her head slightly, the movement eerily familiar. "I am Liara. You knew me as Whisk. I did not wish to frighten you, but the storm forced me to change. You were hurt. I had to help you." Mason blinked rapidly. "You're telling me my pet is actually you?" She gave a small, gentle nod. "It is my nature. My other form is smaller, easier to hide. I can conserve my life force that way. In my true form, I am vulnerable, but I can speak and act freely." Mason shook his head slowly, struggling to process what he was seeing and hearing. Just an hour ago, he thought he had been traveling with a quiet little animal. Now, there was an alien woman in his cockpit. "What exactly are you?" he asked finally. Her blue eyes softened. "The last of the Shiran, and I think my enemies will now know where I am." Mason stared at her in silence, knowing that whatever he had stumbled into, his trip home was no longer going to be quiet. Mason sat frozen in his pilot's chair, his eyes fixed on the tall alien woman standing before him. The gentle hum of the stellar wind's engines was the only sound in the cockpit, yet it felt like the silence between them was heavier than space itself. She had called herself Liara. The name was soft, musical, and seemed to match the calm look in her eyes. But Mason's mind was still wrestling with the fact that Just hours ago, she had been a small, furry creature curled up in his co-pilot's seat. He rubbed a hand across his forehead. "All right, Liara, let's start from the beginning. Why were you pretending to be, well, Whisk?" Liara stepped closer, moving with the smooth, flowing grace of someone who belonged in zero gravity. She didn't seem threatening, but there was a quiet strength in her posture. "The form you first saw was a disguise," she explained through that same calm voice in his mind. "My people can shift between two shapes, one for survival, small, harmless, overlooked, and one true form, as you see now. In my smaller form, I need less energy, and I can hide from those who hunt me." Mason frowned. "Hunt you? Who's hunting you?" She paused, glancing toward the stars outside the viewport. "There is a faction, the Korth. They want something only I know. My people, the Shiran, once guarded a network of ancient gates, wormholes that linked distant parts of the galaxy. Most of them were destroyed to prevent war. Only one remains. The Korth believe I can lead them to it." Mason leaned back slowly. "And I take it, if they find it, they'll use it for something bad?" Her eyes darkened slightly. "They would use it to strike anywhere without warning. No world would be safe." He let out a breath. "So I guess you've been on the run. That explains why you were in a cage on Karos 7. She nodded once. "I had been hiding on a small moon near the colony. The merchant who caught me thought I was simply an exotic pet. He didn't know what I truly was. When you bought me, I saw a chance to leave without revealing myself." Mason ran a hand down his face. "I don't know whether to feel lucky I bought you, or unlucky that I just put a giant target on my ship." Her voice softened. "I understand if you wish to leave me somewhere safe. I do not wish to endanger you." He studied her for a long moment. There was something in her tone, not fear for herself but concern for him. And that, strangely, made him trust her more. "I'm not in the habit of tossing people out into space," Mason said finally. "If someone's after you, we'll deal with it. But I need to know what we're up against." They didn't have to wait long for the answer. Only a day later, the ship's long-range scanners picked up movement. A single dot appeared on the radar, small but moving fast. Mason adjusted the view, and the ship's external cameras zoomed in. A sleek, black vessel was cutting through the emptiness of space, its hull covered in sharp angles that looked like they could cut the stars themselves. Mason's stomach tightened. "I'm guessing that's not a friendly merchant ship." Liara stepped beside him, her expression turning tense. "Korth scout craft. If one is here, more will follow. They've found me." Mason's hands moved quickly over the controls. "All right. Then we're not going to make this easy for them." He changed course sharply, sending the stellar wind into a steep climb toward a nearby asteroid belt. Liara looked at him, a question in her eyes. "They won't risk heavy fire in an asteroid field," Mason explained. "Too easy to smash themselves into rocks." The scout craft followed. The belt loomed ahead, massive stones spinning slowly in the darkness. Mason guided the ship between two enormous boulders, weaving through the twisting path like a thread through a needle. The black ship stayed on them, weaving almost as smoothly. "They're good," Mason muttered. "Too good." Liara closed her eyes for a moment. The control panels flickered strangely, as if touched by invisible hands. Then the radar display shifted. Two more ships appeared, closing in from the opposite side of the belt. "They're trying to box us in," Mason said. "I can disrupt their tracking systems for a short time," Liara said quickly, "but it will take energy." "Do it," Mason said without hesitation. Liara placed both hands on the navigation console. Mason felt a faint vibration run through the ship, and the screens filled with static. Then suddenly the radar cleared, but the pursuing ships were gone. "They've lost us," Mason said, surprised. "At least for now." Liara's shoulders sagged slightly. "They will not give up so easily. We should head somewhere they cannot follow." "And where exactly is that?" Mason asked. Her gaze met his. The last wormhole gate. It is far, but if we reach it, we can vanish from this part of space entirely. They plotted a course away from the Korth's usual patrol zones. For several hours, space was silent except for the gentle hum of the ship. Mason noticed Liara seemed quieter too, as if saving her strength. He made them both some tea. Well, tea for him and a nutrient drink for her. They sat together in the galley, the small table between them. "So," Mason said, "tell me something about the Charon. What was your world like?" Her eyes softened at the question. "It was a world of rivers and crystal forests. Our cities floated above the water, connected by light bridges. We valued harmony with each other and with the stars, but harmony made us slow to see danger. When the Korth came, we were not ready." Mason listened quietly. It was strange. He had transported goods for alien clients before, but none had spoken to him so openly about their lives. "You must have friends still out there," he said. Liara shook her head. "The Korth do not leave survivors. I am the last." The words hung in the air. Mason wasn't sure what to say, so he didn't. Instead, he refilled her drink and changed the subject, asking about the wormhole gates. She explained that they were built by an ancient civilization long before either of their species existed. The gates could open pathways across impossible distances in an instant. The Charon had been chosen as their protectors, ensuring they were only used for peace. But when the Korth began using stolen gates for war, the Charon destroyed most of them, leaving only one hidden for emergencies. "That's the one we're going to?" Mason asked. "Yes. It lies in a forgotten system near a dying star. It has slept for centuries." Mason took a slow sip of tea. "Well, sounds like the kind of place no one would bother to look. That's good for us. But space has a way of turning plans upside down." 2 days later, alarms rang again. Mason rushed to the cockpit to see a massive blip on the scanner, bigger than before. This time it wasn't just a scout. It was a full Korth frigate, built for battle, moving in fast. "They must have guessed our course," Mason said. Liara's expression hardened. "We will not outrun that ship in open space." Mason thought fast. There was a nebula nearby, a cloud of thick gas that could hide them from scanners, but it was full of unstable ion pockets. Flying through it was like running through a lightning storm. He glanced at Liara. "How are your nerves with dangerous flying?" "If it keeps us alive, I trust you." That was all he needed. He angled the ship toward the swirling colors of the nebula. The Korth frigate followed. Inside the nebula, visibility dropped to almost nothing. Purple and blue gas swirled around them, lit from within by sudden bursts of lightning. The stellar wind shook with every close discharge, and Mason's hands danced over the controls, making constant corrections. The frigate fired once, a bright beam slicing through the gas, but it missed. Mason ducked between two dense clouds, cutting power for a moment to hide their heat signature. Liara's eyes were closed again, her hands resting lightly on the console. Mason felt the ship's systems adjusting subtly, shields strengthening in just the right spots, engines shifting to a quieter hum. She was helping him fly without even touching the controls. Finally, after what felt like hours, they burst out of the far side of the nebula. Mason checked the scanner. The frigate was gone. He let out a long breath. "That's twice now we've escaped. I don't think they're going to like us much after this." Liara gave the faintest smile. "They will be more determined than ever. We must reach the gate soon." Mason nodded. "Then let's not waste any time." He adjusted their heading toward the coordinates she had given him, a sense of determination settling in. He still didn't know exactly how he'd gotten pulled into all this, but one thing was certain: he wasn't about to let the Korth take her. The journey to the hidden wormhole gate was not a straight one. Mason and Liara had to weave through remote star systems, avoiding main trade lanes where the Korth could easily track them. The stars stretched endlessly outside the stellar winds. Windows, a calm picture hiding the tension in Mason's mind. Every time the radar beeped, he expected to see another Korth ship closing in. Liara sat quietly most of the time, saving her strength. Mason could see her growing more tired each day they traveled. He didn't understand exactly how her energy worked, but he knew that using her powers, interfering with enemy systems, hiding their trail, cost her something. One evening, as the ship drifted through a quiet sector filled with floating ice chunks, Mason brought her a warm drink. "You okay?" he asked, setting the cup in front of her. She looked up at him with a faint smile. "I am well enough. My smaller form would help me recover faster, but I fear the Korth will come soon. I must stay ready." Mason leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "You've been running for how long now?" Her gaze shifted to the window, where icy reflections danced against the glass. "Since the fall of Shira Prime, that was 5 of your years ago. 5 years." Mason tried to imagine living in constant fear for that long. "You ever think about not running?" Her eyes met his again. "If I stop, they will take me. If they take me, they will find the gate. And if they find the gate, many will die. So no, Mason Hale, I do not think about stopping." He nodded slowly. "Then I guess we keep moving." 3 days later, the hidden system appeared on their navigation charts, a faint cluster of stars deep in an unmarked region. Mason felt a mix of relief and caution. Relief that they were close. Caution because he knew the Korth wouldn't give, up until the very last moment. Liara stood beside him in the cockpit, her blue eyes focused on the central display. "The gate lies near the smallest star in this system. It is weak, but still stable. We will need to activate it manually." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Manually? You mean like actually walking onto it and flipping a switch?" Her lips curved in a small smile. "Not exactly, but it will require me to connect directly with its core. That will take time." Time. That was the one thing Mason was sure they wouldn't have much of. As they drew closer, the main viewport, filled with the image of a dying yellow star, its light dim and flickering. Orbiting it was a ring-shaped structure the size of a small moon. The wormhole gate looked ancient. Its surface was cracked, and parts of its frame floated slightly, a part held together by some invisible force. Faint patterns of blue light pulsed slowly along its outer edge, like a heartbeat barely holding on. Mason let out a low whistle. "That's it. Doesn't look like much." Liara's voice in his mind was softer now. "It is old, but its strength is hidden inside." They approached carefully, Mason keeping one eye on the radar. So far, no sign of Korth ships. "All right," Mason said. "How do we start this thing?" Liara stepped closer to the control panel. "Bring us to the inner ring. I will need to be near its core." Mason guided the stellar wind into position, the massive frame of the gate filling their view. When they were close enough, Liara opened the hatch. Mason followed her, uneasy about leaving the ship, but he didn't want her going alone. They stepped out onto a small maintenance platform that jutted from the side of the ring. Mason's boots clanged softly against the ancient metal. Up close, the gate felt alive. He could hear a faint hum, like a giant sleeping machine. Liara moved to a central console, her hands hovering over the strange symbols carved into it. Blue light began to gather around her fingers. "I will awaken it," she told him. "Stay alert. They may already know we are here." Mason tightened his grip on his blaster. Not that he expected to do much against a warship, but it made him feel better. The blue light grew brighter, spreading from Liara's hands into the console, then racing along the cracks in the gate's surface. Mason watched in awe as the ancient structure began to glow, lines of energy crawling up and down its massive frame. The air itself seemed to vibrate, Then the radar on Mason's wrist unit beeped. He glanced down. His stomach sank. Liara. She didn't stop working. How many? One. Big one. And it's coming in fast. Her voice stayed calm, though he could feel the urgency in it. Keep them away as long as you can. Mason sprinted back into the stellar wind, sealing the hatch behind him. He jumped into the pilot's seat, powering up the engines. A moment later, a Korth destroyer dropped out of hyperspace, its black hull bristling with weapons. Of course they send the big one, Mason muttered. He fired the engines and swung the freighter into the destroyer's path, sending a burst of decoy flares into space. The Korth ship opened fire, streams of red energy lighting up the darkness. Mason dodged left, then rolled the ship hard to the right, skimming the edge of the gate's ring. The destroyer followed, but Mason knew they wouldn't risk hitting the gate. It was too valuable. That gave him room to play. He darted between the floating sections of the ancient structure, using them as cover. Each time the destroyer tried to get a clear shot, Mason twisted out of the way, forcing them to waste time repositioning. "Come on, Liara," he muttered, checking the external cameras. Through the feed, he could see her still at the console, blue light swirling around her like a storm. The gate was glowing brighter now, its inner ring starting to spin. But the destroyer was adapting. Two smaller attack craft detached from its sides, flanking Mason's position. He gritted his teeth. "All right, you want to play? Let's play." He cut the Stellar Wind's main engines for a moment, letting the attackers think they had him pinned. As they closed in, he fired 2 cargo containers from the ship's rear launch bay. The containers spun out into space and exploded, sending a cloud of metal debris into the attacker's path. One ship veered off in time. The other didn't, slamming into the debris and spinning out of control. The victory was short-lived. The destroyer's main cannons fired again, and this time the shot grazed Mason's port engine. Warning lights flared on the control panel. "Mason!" Liara's voice filled his mind. "The gate is almost ready. Just a little longer." "Not sure how much longer I can give you," he replied through gritted teeth, forcing the ship into another tight turn. The gate's inner ring spun faster now, blue energy forming a swirling vortex in its center. Mason knew what that meant. They were seconds away from having an open wormhole. He swung the Stellar Wind back toward the platform, opening the cargo bay doors mid-flight. "Liara, time to go!" She didn't hesitate. The moment he brought the ship close, she leapt from the platform into the bay, her silver hair streaming behind her. Mason hit the thrusters, aiming the ship straight for the wormhole. The destroyer tried to block them, moving to position itself in front of the gate. Mason's eyes narrowed. "Not today!" He fired the remaining cargo crates directly at the destroyer's path. They exploded into another wave of debris, forcing the massive ship to slow just enough for the Stellar Wind to slip past. The glowing vortex of the wormhole filled the viewport. Mason gripped the controls tightly as they plunged into it, the light swallowing them whole. When the light faded, they were somewhere else entirely. The stars outside were unfamiliar. No trade routes, no known markers, just the quiet of a hidden system, untouched and safe. Mason let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. "Well, we made it." Liara stood beside him, her expression calm but her eyes bright with something like relief. "We are safe. For now." Mason gave a small grin. "Guess I'm getting used to running for my life." She tilted her head in that familiar way, the gesture reminding him of the small creature he had first met. "You could have left me behind," she said softly. "But you didn't." "Yeah, well," Mason replied. "I figure I'm already in this deep. Might as well see it through." For the first time since they'd met, Liara's smile reached her eyes. And in that quiet, hidden corner of the galaxy, Mason knew their journey wasn't over, just taking a new turn. The wormhole's swirling light faded behind them, leaving only the deep silence of space. Mason sat in the pilot's seat, still gripping the controls tighter than necessary. The stellar wind was intact, and the radar showed nothing but empty stars. No Korth ships. No pursuit. For the first time in weeks, Mason let his shoulders relax. "We did it," he murmured. Liara stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the vast view outside. "Yes. We have reached the safe system." The space before them looked untouched. Stars glittered like scattered diamonds, and a soft golden nebula stretched across one side of the viewport. In the distance, Mason could make out a large planet with swirling clouds and 3 smaller moons. He leaned back in his chair. "Not bad. Could almost pass for peaceful." Liara glanced at him. "It is peaceful, for now. But the Korth may still try to follow. The gate will remain open for a short time before it closes again. If they traced us—" Mason nodded, his mood sobering. "Then we better not waste time. Where do we go from here?" She moved closer to the navigation display. "The planet ahead is called Thalanar. It was once used by my people as a rest world. There may be shelters, resources, perhaps even old equipment we could use." The trip to Thalanar took a few hours. Mason used the time to check the ship's systems. The damage from the Korth's last attack was minor, but still needed repair. One of the engines had taken a glancing hit, and he would need to replace a few parts soon. Liara spent most of the time in quiet thought, occasionally glancing at the stars as if listening to something Mason couldn't hear. Finally, the planet grew larger in the viewport, a lush sphere of green and blue. As they entered the atmosphere, Mason was surprised to see how alive it looked. Rolling forests stretched for miles, broken by wide rivers that shimmered in the sunlight. "Not bad," Mason said. "If you were looking for a vacation spot, this place would do." "It was a sanctuary once," Liara replied softly. "We would come here to rest and heal." They sat down on a flat clearing near the edge of a wide river. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of plants Mason didn't recognize. Birds, or something like birds, flew in small groups overhead. They stepped out of the ship, the ground soft beneath their boots. Mason stretched his arms. "Feels good to breathe something that isn't recycled air." Liara walked ahead, scanning the tree line. "There should be a shelter nearby. My people built them to last." Sure enough, after a short walk, they found a structure half covered in vines. It was built from smooth white stone, its shape curved and elegant, blending into the natural surroundings. The entrance was intact, and inside the air was cool and dry. Mason ran his hand over one of the walls. "Looks like it's been empty for a long time, but still holding up." Liara moved to a central console, brushing away the dust. She pressed her palm against it, and to Mason's surprise, faint blue lights came to life along the walls. "The power core still works," she said. "We can use this place for repairs and supplies." For the next day, Mason focused on fixing the ship, while Liara searched the shelter. She found sealed containers of preserved food, medical kits, and tools, most of which Mason had never seen before. The tools seemed to shape themselves to his hands, adjusting size and grip as if they knew what he needed. That night, they sat outside the shelter, a small fire crackling between them. Above, the night sky was filled with more stars than Mason had ever seen. "You know," Mason said, poking at the fire, "this almost feels normal, like we're just camping." Liara looked at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I have not had a moment like this in a very long time." He nodded. "Guess that makes 2 of us." The peace didn't last. On the second morning, Mason was checking the ship's repaired engine when the ship's long-range scanner let out a soft, steady tone. Not the loud, urgent alarm of an attack, but a quiet ping that meant something was moving at the very edge of detection range. Mason's stomach tightened. He quickly adjusted the scanner's focus. A small object was approaching the planet, slow and steady. It wasn't broadcasting a signal. Liara appeared beside him, her eyes narrowing. They found a way through. Mason swore under his breath. "I thought you said the gate would close." It did, but they must have sent a probe through before it shut. The probe could have mapped the coordinates for the larger ships to follow. He turned to her. "Then we need to move before they arrive." Liara shook her head. "The ship cannot outpace them if they are already on their way. We must hide and make them believe we are not here." Mason didn't like the idea of leaving his ship behind, but Liara was right. If the Korth detected any trace of the stellar wind, they'd know exactly where to look. They moved quickly, camouflaging the ship under heavy foliage and activating its stealth systems. Then they left the clearing, heading deeper into the forest. The forest was dense but quiet, filled with tall trees whose leaves shimmered faintly in the light. Mason followed Liara along narrow paths that twisted between roots and rocks. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, never hesitating. After an hour, they reached a rocky ridge overlooking the river. Liara crouched low, scanning the sky. "From here we will see them if they arrive." They didn't have to wait long. By late afternoon, a black shape broke through the clouds, a Korth gunship. Sleek, angular, and bristling with weapons, it swept over the forest in slow, deliberate passes. Mason kept low, his eyes following its movement. "They're scanning." "Yes," Liara said. "But if we remain hidden, they may think this world is empty." The gunship made 2 more passes before it turned and disappeared toward the horizon. Mason exhaled slowly. "Think they bought it?" he asked. Liara's gaze stayed on the sky. "Perhaps. But they will not leave yet. They will search every moon, every canyon, every river. We must be ready if they return." That night, they stayed in the old shelter, lights dimmed to avoid detection. Mason couldn't sleep much. He kept thinking about how far they had come and how close the Korth still were. At some point, Liara spoke softly into his mind. "You are worried." "Of course I'm worried," Mason replied quietly. "We keep escaping by inches. Sooner or later they'll catch up." "Perhaps," she said, "but every time you find a way. You are resourceful. That is why we are still alive." Mason let out a small, tired laugh. "Not sure if that's skill or just luck." "Sometimes they are the same," she replied. The next day brought worse news. From the ridge, they spotted not 1 but 2 Korth ships entering the atmosphere. These were larger than the gunship, built for ground operations. Mason's jaw tightened. "They're not just scanning anymore. They're hunting," Liara nodded. "Then we cannot hide forever. We must turn the hunt against them." Mason gave her a look. "I'm listening. The old shelters are connected by hidden tunnels. If we lead them into one and collapse it behind them, it will trap them for a time, long enough for us to reach the ship and escape." It was risky, but Mason couldn't think of a better option. They spent the next few hours preparing. Liara showed Mason the entrance to one of the tunnels, hidden beneath a fallen tree. Inside, the walls glowed faintly with blue light. Mason planted a series of small charges along the narrowest section, careful to set the timers for when they'd be far away. By late afternoon, the Korth search parties were moving through the forest. Mason and Liara stayed just ahead of them, making sure to leave subtle traces, broken branches, footprints in the soft soil, just enough to draw them toward the tunnel. The plan worked. Mason glanced back to see black armored figures entering the tunnel in single file, their weapons ready. He and Liara slipped out through a side passage, hurrying back toward the ship. Moments later, a deep rumble shook the ground as the charges went off. Liara didn't look back. That will not stop them forever, but it will slow them. Mason pushed through the last stretch of trees, the camouflaged stellar wind coming into view. Then let's not waste it. They took off quickly, the ship cutting through the clouds and back into open space. Mason angled them away from Thalinar, his eyes scanning the radar for pursuit. For now, there was none. But Mason knew the Korth would keep coming. They always did. Liara stood beside him, steady despite the chase. They will not stop until they believe I am gone forever, or until we stop them. Mason's hands tightened on the controls. Then maybe it's time we stop running. Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment, and in her eyes, Mason saw the spark of agreement. The stellar wind flew through the hidden system's quiet stars, but Mason knew the peace wouldn't last. The Korth had found them once. They would find them again. And this time, Liara was right. They couldn't keep running forever. He sat in the pilot's seat, thinking while Liara studied the navigation charts beside him. The golden nebula glowed faintly in the distance, a silent backdrop to their thoughts. Finally, Mason spoke. We've been playing defense since the day I found you. Maybe it's time to switch sides. Liara looked at him, her blue eyes steady. You mean to fight them directly? He nodded. Not head on. We can't outgun them, but maybe we can outthink them. She tilted her head slightly, listening. Mason tapped the screen, showing a cluster of small moons orbiting the largest planet in the system. Those moons are full of dense mineral deposits. The Korth's scanners will have trouble picking up anything moving through there. If we can lure them close, we can use the terrain against them. Liara studied the display. If we are to lure them, we must give them something they cannot ignore. Mason gave her a small grin. That's where you come in. The plan was simple, at least on paper. They would send out a faint signal from the stellar wind, one that looked like a distress beacon coming from Liara herself. Mason would keep the ship in the shadows of the mineral-rich moons while the signal drew the Korth in. Then, using a combination of the ship's decoys and the moon's unstable magnetic fields, they would try to disable the Korth ships long enough to escape. For good, Liara agreed, though Mason could see the weight of the decision in her expression. If this fails, she began. It won't, Mason said, more confidently than he felt. We've made it this far. They spent hours preparing. Mason modified the ship's systems to send out the fake beacon on the exact frequency the Korth used to track her. Liara adjusted the decoy drones so they could mimic the stellar wind's energy signature, making it harder for the Korth to know which was the real ship. When everything was ready, they flew to the far side of the largest moon and switched on the signal. The sound of the soft ping filled the cockpit, and Mason knew it was only a matter of time before someone heard it. They didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, the radar showed movement, 2 Korth frigates entering the system. Mason's jaw tightened. Here they come. Liara placed a hand lightly on the console. Stay calm. They will believe the signal is real. The frigates split up, one heading toward the moon's far side, the other circling low. Mason kept the stellar wind tucked in the moon's shadow, drifting slowly while the decoy drones floated out into open space. The Korth ship on the far side picked up speed, chasing one of the drones. The other frigate closed in on another decoy. Mason watched the radar closely, waiting for the moment when both ships were fully distracted. Almost. Now, he muttered, hitting the controls. The stellar wind shot out from the moon's shadow, heading straight for the gap between the 2 frigates. The drones scattered, sending false readings to the Korth sensors. Immediately, the frigates reacted. Too late. Mason guided the ship into a narrow space between 2 smaller moons, their surfaces jagged and glowing faintly with mineral heat. The Korth followed, but the mineral fields began to interfere with their targeting systems. Streams of red energy. Fire went wide, hitting the moon's rocky surface instead. Liara focused, her eyes glowing faintly as she reached out to the moon's magnetic fields. The ship's sensors shifted, and Mason saw the interference spike on the Korth's radar displays. "They're losing their lock on us," Mason said. "Good! Keep them chasing," Liara replied. Mason dove the ship lower, skimming so close to. The moon's surface, that jagged peaks, rushed past the windows. The Korth frigates struggled to follow without crashing, their movements growing slower and more cautious. Then Mason saw his chance. One of the moons had a deep, narrow canyon cutting across its surface. He steered toward it, engines flaring. The frigates came after them, squeezing into the canyon in single file. "This is it," Mason said. "Get ready." As they raced through the canyon, Mason triggered the ship's rear launch bay. 2 modified. Cargo containers shot out behind them, each packed with magnetic charges Liara had calibrated. The containers tumbled end over end until they struck the canyon walls. A blinding burst of magnetic energy exploded behind the stellar wind, scrambling every scanner and engine coil in the canyon. The first Korth frigate slammed to a halt, its systems dead. The second crashed into the first, sparks and debris flying in all directions. Mason didn't wait to admire the result. He pulled the stellar wind up and out of the canyon, heading for open space. For a moment, it looked like they had done it. The radar showed the 2 frigates still tangled in the canyon, their systems offline. But then a third blip appeared, a smaller, faster ship racing toward them from the edge of the system. "They had a backup," Mason muttered. Liara stepped closer, her voice calm despite the situation. "Then we end this." The smaller Korth ship closed in quickly, firing bursts of energy that rocked the stellar wind. Mason dodged and weaved, but the new attacker was fast, faster than anything they'd faced yet. "Suggestions?" Mason asked tightly. "Yes," Liara said. "Head for the nebula." The golden nebula loomed ahead, its swirling gases beautiful and dangerous. Mason understood her plan instantly. Inside, visibility would drop to almost nothing, and the unstable electrical currents could be used to their advantage. They plunged into the glowing clouds, the light wrapping around the ship in soft, shifting waves. The Korth ship followed, its weapons firing blindly through the mist. Liara closed her eyes, focusing. Mason felt the ship's shields adjusting, redirecting energy toward the front. Then she spoke into his mind. "When I say, cut the engines." They weaved through the nebula, currents of light and static dancing outside. Mason kept one eye on the radar as the Korth ship drew closer. "Now," Liara said suddenly. Mason cut the engines. The stellar wind went dark, drifting silently. The Korth ship shot past, unable to stop in time. "Light them up," Mason said, reigniting the engines. He fired the ship's remaining magnetic charges, sending them straight into the Korth's rear engines. The blast sent the enemy ships spinning out of control, disappearing deeper into the nebula. Silence filled the cockpit. Mason's breathing slowed as the adrenaline faded. That's it, right? We're clear?" Liara nodded, her expression both relieved and tired. "For now, yes. We have hurt them badly. They will think twice before chasing us again." Mason leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "Good, because I'm officially done with running." She gave him a faint smile. "So am I." They left the nebula behind, setting a course for the far edge of the hidden system. Mason didn't know where they would go next, but he knew it wouldn't be anywhere the Korth could find easily. As the stars stretched into lines ahead of them, he glanced at Liara. "You know, when I bought you back on Caros 7, I thought I was just getting a quiet little pet to keep me company." Her smile widened just a little. "And instead, you got a war." "Yeah," Mason said with a chuckle. "But also a friend." Her eyes softened. "Yes, a friend." In the quiet hum of the stellar wind, with danger behind them and the unknown ahead, Mason realized something important. For all the chaos and close calls, he wouldn't trade this journey for anything. Not the stars, not the safety of his old routine. Because now he wasn't just drifting through space. He had a purpose. And somewhere out there, between the moons and the nebulae, between old gates and ancient secrets, Mason, Hale, and Layara were going to write the next chapter of their story together.